In the heart of a winter so cold it could silence the mountains, a small town found itself pulled into a mystery that began with a single set of paw prints fading in the snow. A loyal German shepherd vanished into the storm, a little girl braved the freezing night to follow him, and an officer with a quiet heart stepped into the darkness, not knowing how far the trail would lead. What happened next would test courage, faith, and the unspoken bond between people and the animals who guard their lives. Before we begin this journey of hope and danger, tell me where you are watching from. Leave a comment below and share your corner of the world with us. The first real snow of December came down over Pine Meadow like a quiet verdict. The little mountain town, tucked in a valley between dark pines and low, brooding ridges, was used to winter, but this storm felt different. The wind pushed long ribbons of snow across the empty highway, smearing the world into gray and white. Streetlights glowed like tired halos, and every sound seemed swallowed by the cold. Officer Evan Marlowe drove slowly through it, his patrol SUV moving like a lone lantern in a sea of falling ice. Evan was 36, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made people lower their voices without knowing why. His hair was dark, threaded with the first hints of gray at the temples, and his eyes carried the calm of someone who had seen chaos before and chosen to stand against it. Years in the military and later in law enforcement had carved quiet lines into his face, not of bitterness, but of watchfulness. He spoke little, listened much, and carried a steady patience that Pine Meadow had come to depend on. Tonight, however, his patience was wrapped tight around a quiet tension he couldn't quite name. The storm had come in faster than expected, and the radio had already crackled with minor accidents and stranded vehicles. On the seat behind him sat Shadow, his German shepherd partner, a 5-year-old dog with a dense black and tan coat and sharp amber eyes that missed nothing. Shadow was large but lean, his muscles moving smoothly under his fur like coiled springs. Off-duty, he could be gentle, almost goofy with the few people he trusted. On duty, he was all focus, a creature born from discipline and instinct. To Evan, he was more than a canine partner. He was the one presence that made the long nights feel less empty. As they rolled down the 2-lane road skirting the edge of town, Shadow sat upright, ears pricked, nose working against the faint click of the heater. Out here, the town dissolved into scattered cabins, barns, and stands of pine reaching toward the sky like black frozen prayers. Pine Meadow itself was small, a diner that never changed its menu, a hardware store that had been there longer than most of its customers, a church with a steeple that disappeared into the snow whenever storms came in. People here knew each other's names, each other's hurts, each other's dogs. That was partly why the quiet knot in Evan's chest tightened whenever he thought of the storm and the darkness and all the things that could go wrong inside them. Shadow suddenly gave a low whine, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Evan leaned forward, squinting through the blur of headlight and snow. At first, he thought it was just another snowdrift, a trick of the storm. But then the shape moved. He braked gently, the SUV slowing to a crawl, the beams cut through the swirling white, washing over a small figure standing on the narrow strip of snow between the road and the trees. A child, barely more than a smudge of color, against the storm. Evan's heartbeat kicked once, hard. He flipped on his hazard lights and pulled to the shoulder. Shadow let out a sharp bark, as if urging him to hurry. When Evan opened the door, the cold hit him like a wall, slicing through his uniform. Snowflakes needled his face as he stepped out, boots crunching into the powder. "Hey!" he called, pitching his voice firm but gentle. "Stay right there. I'm coming to you." The little girl didn't run. She just stood there, arms wrapped around herself, legs trembling. As Evan drew closer, he saw her clearly. 8 years old, maybe, small and thin, under a too light pink coat that was dusted with snow. Her brown hair was tangled, strands frozen to her cheeks, and her pale skin had taken on a worrying bluish tint at the edges of her lips. Her eyes, wide, hazel, and shining with a mix of fear and stubbornness, watched him like a cornered animal that had not yet decided whether to trust. This was Lily Carter, though he didn't know her name yet. At 8, she was the kind of child that often went unnoticed by busy adults, quiet at school, polite, always the one to help a teacher stack books or comfort another kid who had fallen. She'd grown up fast in a house where adults were more tired than strong, and somewhere inside her small frame lived a stubborn courage that didn't always align with her size. "Hey," Evan said again, crouching to bring himself to her eye level despite the snow piling on his shoulders. "My name's Evan. I'm a police officer. You're safe now, okay?" Shadow had jumped out as well, but stayed just behind Evan's shoulder, body tense but tail low and still, reading the girl with the uncanny sensitivity of a trained dog. Lily's eyes flicked toward Shadow, and something in her expression broke. She took a small step forward, then another, her lips moving before sound caught up. "He took him," she whispered, voice rough from the cold. "He took Copper." Her breath came in shaky bursts, fogging in the air. Evan's gaze swept over her quickly, the way training and instinct demanded. Her hands were bare and reddened, her knees damp where she must have stumbled in the snow. She swayed slightly as she stood there, and he could feel the cold leaking into her bones just by looking at her. "Okay, Lily," he said gently, choosing her name as a guess, then correcting when she nodded. "Where's your home? How far have you walked?" She glanced over her shoulder, toward the darkness beyond the tree line, and the faint, distant glow of town. Just back there," she stammered. "Our cabin. I followed his paws. Copper ran after the man, and I followed, but then the truck. It was white and loud, and he picked Copper up and shut the door, and they left." Evan felt the words hit him in pieces. Copper. He knew the name. A German shepherd that an old woman in town often walked past the station. Proud, golden black coat, bright eyes, the chosen guardian of a woman who had lost more than she spoke about. The Carter dog. "You haven't been out here long?" he asked, already knowing the answer from the shallow set of her tracks. They didn't stretch far along the roadside, maybe a few hundred meters at most, blown halfway shut by drifting snow. "No," Lily said, a tear finally slipping free and freezing halfway down her cheek. "It was fast. I ran, then I didn't know where, and it was so cold." Her voice shook uncontrollably now, her shoulders starting to quake. Hypothermia wasn't measured in hours alone. Sometimes, in storms like this, a few minutes were enough to push a small child to the edge. Evan shrugged off his thick jacket and wrapped it around her, the fabric nearly swallowing her frame. "We're going to get you warm," he said, his tone taking on that unarguable calm that children recognized as safety. "We'll talk about Copper once you're inside. Shadow and I will help you. Right, boy?" Shadow stepped forward, lowering his head so he wouldn't seem as large. He sniffed Lily's jacket, tail giving a single, hesitant wag. For a moment, their eyes met. The dog's steady amber gaze and the girl's frightened hazel one. And something in Lily relaxed just enough to let her lean into Evan's arms when he lifted her. She weighed almost nothing, small bones and cold air. As he carried her back to the SUV, she clung to the collar of his uniform as if it were the last solid thing left in the world. "My grandma, she's alone," Lily murmured. "She doesn't walk so good. Copper he was her legs sometimes." Evan's jaw tightened. He knew Mrs. Carter by sight. A woman in her 70s, thin as a winter branch, gray hair usually twisted into a loose bun under a worn knitted cap. She walked with a subtle hitch in her left leg, the echo of some old injury she never talked about. She had a stern mouth but kind eyes, and she lived on a modest pension that barely covered heat and groceries. Copper had been more than a pet. He had been safety, company, and pride all in one. Once Lily was buckled into the front seat, heater blasting warm air over her shaking hands, Evan swung back out into the storm to help Shadow into the back. When he got behind the wheel again, Lily was hugging his jacket tight around herself, eyes half closed as feeling slowly began to creep back into her fingers. "Stay awake," he told her gently as he pulled away from the roadside. "Talk to me, Lily. Tell me about Copper." Her eyes opened again, and though her teeth still chattered, the words came. She described Copper as if she were painting him into the air. 3 years old, big but gentle, with a coat that shone reddish gold in the sun, and a habit of nudging her hand whenever she was sad. Copper had a scar on his right ear from the time he'd chased a raccoon off their porch, and he always slept with his head near the door, as if he were on duty even in his dreams. He likes the snow," Lily whispered, staring at the white blur beyond the windshield. "But not like this. Not when it's scary." Pine Meadows' lights grew clearer ahead, scattered like embers on the hillside. Evan turned down the narrow lane that led to the outskirts, where cabins nestled among the pines. The Carter cabin appeared through the trees, a small wooden house, its roof heavy with snow, a thin thread of smoke curling from the chimney. Warm light leaked from the windows, flickering like hope. Evan parked outside and came around to lift Lily again, careful not to jostle her thawing limbs. Shadow jumped down beside them, his breath puffing in the cold as he scanned the dark tree line, nose twitching for scents that didn't belong. The front door flew open before Evan could knock. Mrs. Carter stood in the doorway, her thin frame wrapped in an old brown cardigan, a long skirt hanging over wool socks and worn slippers. Deep lines fanned from the corners of her eyes, etched by years of worry and winter. But those same eyes were bright now with fear. "Lily!" she cried, voice breaking on her granddaughter's name. She moved faster than her bad leg wanted to allow, reaching out with bony hands that trembled. Despite her age and frailty, there was a steel thread in her posture, the kind of strength that comes from surviving more winters than anyone expected you to. "She's okay," Evan said, stepping inside and letting the warmth of the small cabin fold over them like a blanket. The interior smelled of wood smoke, tea, and old books. "She's cold and tired, but we got to her in time." He set Lily down on a worn couch near the wood stove. Mrs. Carter immediately began rubbing her granddaughter's hands, murmuring soft, half-formed prayers under her breath. Shadow stayed just inside the door, shaking snow from his coat before settling, eyes still fixed on the world outside. "He took Copper," Lily whispered, as if confessing a crime. "I couldn't stop him, Grandma." Mrs. Carter's expression flickered, a flash of raw pain passing through her eyes before she caught it, smoothing her face for Lily's sake. She glanced at Evan, and in that glance was a lifetime of fear, of losing the last things she had left. "Tell me what happened," Evan said, his voice low but firm as he knelt near the stove, letting the heat soak into his fingers. "Everything you remember." Slowly, between Lily's halting words and Mrs. Carter's quiet additions, the picture formed piece by piece. A knock at the door that evening, a man's voice, too smooth, asking for directions and pretending to admire Copper. His clothes ordinary, his smile forgettable. The kind of man you wouldn't look at twice in a grocery store. Later, Copper had started barking at something outside. Lily had cracked the door open just wide enough to see the dog bolt toward the trees, following it whistle, then headlights. A white pickup truck parked near the edge of the lane. By the time Lily had pulled on her boots and coat and chased after Copper, it had already happened. The man lifting Copper, the dog struggling, the door slamming, the engine roaring away into the storm. Lily had followed the paw prints along the roadside until her strength gave out not far from where Evan had found her. When the story was finished, the cabin felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves had drawn in closer to listen. Evan stood and walked to the back door, where a second exit opened toward a small yard. Shadow padded after him. Outside, the wind bit at his face, but the snow in the yard told its own story. The wooden dog kennel sat near the fence, its latch bent and twisted. The wood around it splintered where it had been forced open. The snow around it was churned up, marked by boot prints and paw tracks now partly blurred by fresh snowfall. Just beyond the yard, in the lane, a set of tire tracks carved two rough lines into the white, already softening at the edges, but still legible enough to read, "A heavier vehicle, accelerating fast." Evan crouched to inspect the damage to the kennel, fingers brushing over the broken latch. This wasn't someone opening a gate to coax a friendly dog away. This was force, practiced and efficient. This wasn't random, he muttered to Shadow, who stood beside him, ears forward, nose working furiously over the disturbed snow. They knew what they wanted. Shadow gave a low growl deep in his throat, his body tense, as if he, too, sensed the wrongness lingering in the quiet yard. The wind swept another curtain of snow across the lane, softening the tire tracks further, as if trying to erase the trespass from the world. But Evan had already seen enough. A strange man. A white truck. A deliberate break-in. The theft of a German shepherd that was not just smart, but trained and bonded. His mind flicked through the reports he had skimmed over the past few weeks. Small notices from neighboring towns about missing dogs, rumors that never quite solidified into something bigger. Now standing in the Carter yard, with the storm pressing in and a little girl shivering in the light of a wood stove inside, those fragments rearranged themselves into a shape that made his stomach go cold. This wasn't just one family's loss. It was part of something else, something organized, something that had just drawn a line straight through Pine Meadow. Evan straightened, his breath misting out in front of him. He looked down at Shadow, whose eyes glinted up at him, ready for whatever came next. "This isn't going to be just another missing dog report," Evan said quietly, more to himself than to anyone listening. "We're not letting this go." Inside the cabin, Lily's laughter, weak but real, floated out for a brief heartbeat as Mrs. Carter tried to distract her with stories of Copper's antics. The sound cut. Through the storm, small and fragile, but enough. It gave him the first clear piece of what this night would become. Not just a patrol, not just paperwork, a beginning. He turned back toward the warm doorway, the storm at his back, and something harder than the cold settling in his chest. In that moment, under the falling snow of Pine Meadow, the path ahead began to form, faint at first, like tracks in fresh powder, but it was there, and Evan Marlowe was the kind of man who followed tracks until he found where they ended. The morning after the storm broke over Pine Meadow with a brittle kind of light, the kind that made the snow look like frozen ash scattered across the valley. The air still carried the bite of winter, sharp and unforgiving. Frost clung to every branch like silver veins, and the wind moved quietly now, as if it too were waiting for something to happen. Evan Marlowe stepped out of his cabin, with Shadow at his side, the German shepherd's breath blooming white in the cold dawn. Though Evan had slept only a few restless hours, he moved with a sense of direction, fixed deep in his bones. The night still weighed on him, Lily Carter's trembling form in his arms, the broken kennel, the tire tracks, the look in Mrs. Carter's eyes when she tried to be strong for her granddaughter. There had been many cases in Evan's years of service, but some pressed harder against the heart than others. A stolen dog might sound small to people who didn't know better, but this wasn't just theft. It was a ripping away of safety from a child and an elderly woman who had little else to cling to. He crouched beside the lane, the snow now slightly crusted from the cold. The tire tracks from the night before had softened at the edges but were still clear enough. A heavier vehicle, likely a pickup truck, possibly old. One tire left a faint wobble in its pattern. Shadow sniffed the prints, tail lifted, muscles tense. "You got it, boy?" Shadow let out a small, short bark, focused, certain. Evan followed as Shadow began moving along the road, nose sweeping low across the snow like a compass needle pulling toward true north. The world around them was unnervingly still. Frost sparkled on the pines, the sun barely rising beyond the ridgeline, throwing pale gold through the branches. The trail led away from the Carter home, drifting toward an older part of Pine Meadow where buildings had once thrived but now stood half forgotten. Evan felt the quiet encroaching on him in a familiar way, the buzz of an investigation settling into place. The white truck had gone this way, and Shadow knew it. They walked for nearly a mile, boots cracking through thin ice, until Evan saw the dark shape ahead. Cold timber, the abandoned sawmill. The building had been empty for 5 years, ever since a fire in its main machinery forced it to close. The scars were still there, blackened boards, metal frames warped from heat. Snow had softened the ruin, but it still felt like a skeleton of something that had once lived loud. Shadow slowed near the entrance, sniffing vigorously along the cracked concrete. Evan's breath made a thin cloud in front of him as he surveyed the place. Anyone with sense didn't wander into cold timber, which meant someone without fear, or without a choice, had. "Shadow," he murmured, "steady." Shadow trotted ahead, weaving through a gaping doorway where the old wooden doors hung crooked on their hinges. Evan followed. Flashlight, drawn. The beam cut through lingering shadows, illuminating drifting dust and swirling flakes of snow that had blown inside overnight. Inside, the sawmill was a cavern of echoing silence. Rusted chains hung from overhead tracks like cold vines, and the floor was coated in a thin layer of frost. Wooden planks lay snapped and scattered around the room. Shadow moved toward a corner of the mill where broken pallets had been brushed aside. The dog nosed the ground, tail rigid. Evan stepped closer and felt his pulse slow into a measured beat. There, half buried in frost, was a metal chain, its links shiny and new. Not from the mill, not from the past. Used recently. Shadow sniffed harder, then moved to the left, where something small rested beneath a mound of disturbed snow. A bowl, plastic, still smelling of dog food, still fresh. Evan knelt, brushing snow away. These guys weren't here long, he murmured. The trail was no longer just guesswork. Someone had used this place to hold a dog, or more than one, for at least a short period of time. Copper, Evan whispered under his breath. Shadow suddenly jerked his head toward a metal ladder leading up to an office platform. There, lodged between the slats, something hung, a scrap of fabric, a square cloth, a scarf. Evan pulled it down. The scent hit immediately, dog fur, warm and familiar beneath the chill. Not Shadow. Copper. 100 moments clicked into place. Copper at the town gatherings, kids petting him, Mrs. Carter's frail hands ruffling his fur, Lily throwing a stick for him near the lake. The scarf carried the memory like a soft echo. Shadow barked once, sharply, and Evan turned. Past the broken window pane, a faint lens glinted. An old security camera mounted high on the wall, long abandoned, but maybe not completely dead. Evan climbed the narrow steps to the platform. The office still held an ancient desk, warped by moisture, and a dusty computer tower that should have been thrown out years ago. But the camera was wired into a separate recorder, one that still had a flickering light on its side. "Come on," Evan muttered, powering it on. The screen woke sluggishly, distorted at the edges. Recorded footage scrolled line by line, grainy but visible. A shape emerged. A white truck, sliding into frame like a ghost. Hard to see clearly, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Boxy build, older model, rear bumper dented left of center. The driver was only a blur, hood up, face turned away. But the way he moved, quick and calculated, it wasn't random. Evan leaned closer, heart ticking faster. Shadow paced behind him, restless, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Evan ran through the footage again, eyes narrowing. One detail jumped out. The truck didn't just pass, it lingered. The driver got out, scanned the area, glanced back toward the road, and then returned to the cab. This place wasn't chosen by accident. It was part of a route, a pit stop, temporary but deliberate. His phone buzzed faintly in his pocket. It was dispatch returning his earlier inquiry. "Officer Marlowe, we've got something for you," the operator said. "You asked about missing dogs?" "Yeah. There's been an uptick over the past month. Several towns near Pine Meadow, not just pets, some working dogs too." A coldness that had nothing to do with winter slid through Evan's spine. Copper wasn't the first, and whoever took him wasn't done. Shadow barked again, this time low, vibrating, uneasy. Evan looked around the empty mill, the ghostly dust shifting in the weak sunlight. This place had been chosen because no one came here, because it was a forgotten corner, swallowed by snow and time. But the tracks outside had been fresh. The food bowl wasn't frozen. The scarf smelled strongly of copper. Whoever used this place, they had been here hours ago, and they could always come back. Evan turned to Shadow, a quiet determination setting into his face like stone. "This isn't just a stolen dog," he said softly. "Someone's running something, and we're right in the middle of it now." Shadow nudged his hand with a low rumble of agreement, his breath fogging the cold air. Evan pocketed the scarf, stepped out of the office, and surveyed the abandoned mill one last time. The silence felt different now, not empty, but watchful, like the walls knew something he didn't. He stepped into the snow outside, Shadow close behind, and stared out toward the endless pines. Who would steal trained dogs? Why? How many had already vanished? Questions hung like frost in the air, but the road ahead felt clearer than it had the night before. The trail wasn't cold, not yet. He just had to follow it before the snow buried everything. And with Shadow's nose to the wind, they began the slow, steady walk back toward town. One step deeper into the storm, waiting beyond the trees. The storm eased through the night, leaving Pine Meadow wrapped in the kind of cold silence that only comes after heavy snow. Morning crept in slowly, turning the frost-covered landscape silver. Light trembled across rooftops, glided over frozen fences, and pooled in the hollows of untouched fields. The world looked peaceful, almost deceptively so, like a painting that hid a darker truth beneath its calm brushstrokes. Evan Marlowe drove through the early light, with Shadow in the back seat. his breath still fogging lightly, signaling a steady readiness. Evan's thoughts moved as steadily as the snowplow clearing the main road ahead. Every new detail he'd found in the cold timber mill refused to leave his mind. The fresh chain, the half-eaten dog food, Copper's scarf, the truck captured on camera. Each piece hung in his thoughts like puzzle fragments waiting to be forced together. Today was for talking. Talking, asking, listening. The kind of quiet detective work Pine Meadow was built on. Neighbors knowing neighbors, people noticing what didn't fit. The white pickup had to have passed someone. North Fork Valley was the best place to start. As Evan drove into the valley, he saw the land flatten out into wide pastures lined with frost-brittle wire fences. Old barns leaned slightly to one side, like tired giants. Smoke curled from chimneys of distant farmhouses, and there, just off the main path, stood the Grayson farm. The house was long, low, and made of dark logs that looked older than the family itself. A barn stood beside it, red paint faded and chipped from years of mountain winters. In front of the porch, a tall man wearing a thick flannel jacket and snow-stained boots shoveled a path through the fresh drifts. That was Arthur Grayson, 73 years old, skin leathery from decades under the sun and wind. His hair had gone fully white, but still grew thick beneath his wool cap. He was known for his stubbornness, straightforwardness, and for having survived 2 heart attacks that, according to town rumor, had been too scared to finish him off. A man like him didn't spook easily, and didn't miss much happening around his property. Shadow let out a soft woof as Evan parked and stepped out. "Morning," Evan called over the crunch of snow under his boots. Grayson paused mid-shovel, leaning heavily on the handle as he squinted toward the officer. "If it isn't Officer Marlowe," he grumbled, though his tone was not unfriendly. "What brings you to my end of the world this early? Shadow 2, I see." Shadow moved beside Evan with perfect discipline, tail low, eyes alert. Evan approached the porch, scanning the ground automatically. "Morning, sir. I'm checking on something that may have happened last night. I heard you have a camera on the road by your cattle gate." Grayson snorted. "That camera's been there since the Wilson boys tried to steal one of my goats 5 years ago. Fool things. Couldn't have picked a worse place to trespass." "Does it still record?" "It records everything. Hard drive in the barn. Come on." Grayson led him across the snow toward the barn, where a faint trail of boot prints already existed, half filled with fresh flakes. Inside, the barn smelled of hay, old leather, and the faint metallic tang of snowmelt dripping off the tin roof. In the corner, a small workstation was set up, a table with mismatched legs, a flickering monitor, and a security recorder, humming softly. Grayson sat in the creaky chair, tapped a few keys, and brought up last night's footage, and there it was. A white pickup truck barreling down the road at around 4 a.m., moving fast enough to kick up a spray of snow behind it. The video wasn't perfect, grainy and a little distorted around the edges, but the important details were right there. The truck's back bumper dented on the left side, driver's side mirror partially taped, tail lights flickering slightly, and most telling, the license plate covered with strips of black tape. Evan leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "That's our vehicle," he murmured. Grayson let out a low whistle. "What are they doing out here before dawn? Road wasn't even plowed yet. Had to be someone desperate or up to something." "Likely the second one," Evan said. "You find something else?" Grayson asked. Evan hesitated, but only for a second. Grayson wasn't the type to gossip and wasn't the type to scare. A dog was stolen last night. Could be connected to some other cases. Grayson stiffened. He'd raised animals all his life. Theft was one of the few things that drew real anger out of him. "You tell me if you need anything. Folks around here look out for our own." Evan nodded. "Thank you, really." He copied the footage to a flash drive, shook Grayson's hand, and headed back toward his vehicle. Shadow hopped in with a soft grunt, settling quickly but keeping one eye fixed on the tree line. Evan drove away, mind racing, piecing things together. A white truck, concealed plate, routes leading out of town. The abductors were cautious, organized enough to avoid random stops. But something else nagged at him, something personal. A feeling he should have brushed off but couldn't. Back home, after finishing his reports, Evan stepped inside his cabin just as evening crept back across Pine Meadow. The golden glow of his lamplight washed across wooden walls and over Shadow's food bowls. He had barely taken 2 steps inside when Shadow stiffened, ears forward, head up. A short, sharp bark. Then, glass shattered behind him. A stone flew through the small window near the door, dropping sharply onto the floorboards. Shadow lunged forward, snarling, but Evan was already moving, a hand up to calm the dog. The wind howled through the broken window, carrying flakes of snow inside. On the floor lay a rock wrapped in a scrap of paper. Evan bent down, slowly, and unfolded it. The message was written in thick, angry strokes. Letters pressed so hard the pen nearly tore the page. Stop. If you want to keep your dog. Shadow growled deeply, pacing, muscles taut beneath his fur. His amber eyes flickered between Evan and the window, as if demanding permission to chase whatever threat lingered outside. Easy, boy, Evan murmured, though his own pulse thudded hard in his throat. He moved to the doorway, peering into the dark. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes, blanketing footprints, swallowing sound. Whoever had thrown the rock was long gone. But their message couldn't have been clearer, and Shadow had been threatened directly. Evan placed a hand gently on the dog's neck, feeling the warmth and steady rhythm beneath the fur. They know we're looking, he whispered, and they're scared enough to warn us. He called his superior immediately, reporting the threat word for word. The captain's reply was grim. Backup stuck south of the ridge. Roads are iced over. Storms slowed everything down. We'll send a deputy when the pass opens. Which could take hours or days. Evan hung up, jaw tightening. He wasn't acting alone because he wanted to. He was acting alone because the storm had cut the town off from help. But at least now he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The people behind Copper's disappearance were watching him. They knew his name, they knew his dog, they knew he wouldn't stop. And that meant he was getting close. Very close. Evan stood in the dim lamplight, Shadow pressed against his side, both staring out at the swirling snow beyond the window. The shadows of North Fork Valley weren't just behind him now. They were closing in. Snowcrest Ridge rose above Pine Meadow like a white spine of some ancient creature, its slopes buried beneath fresh drifts of snow that glistened under the weak afternoon sun. The storm had finally loosened its grip on the town, revealing a sky so pale it looked almost translucent. But the cold remained fierce, sharp enough to sting the lungs with every breath. Evan Marlowe stood beside his patrol SUV at the edge of the Ranger Trail, wind tugging at the collar of his coat as he listened to the shaky voice on the other end of his radio. It was a local hunter, George Lattimore, a man in his 50s with a quiet temperament and sharp instincts, reporting that he'd heard something unusual on the ridge earlier that day. Not wolves, not coyotes, dogs, many of them, and trapped. Evan had heard desperation in George's tone, something that didn't come easily for a man who had spent decades walking the mountain alone with only his rifle and the whisper of snow for company. Within minutes, the rapid response team assembled, 2 deputies, 1 ranger medic, and Evan with Shadow. Snowmobiles hummed to life, engines growling against the quiet of the wilderness. The ridge was a labyrinth of frost-covered pines and jagged boulders. In winter, most hikers stayed far away. Even hunters avoided the area during the worst storms. If someone wanted to hide something, or someone up here, they could do so without fear of discovery. But today, the mountain would not hide anything. Evan climbed onto the lead snowmobile, Shadow leaping behind him with fluid grace, settling in as though he'd been born for this purpose. The dog's breath puffed white into the air, his eyes bright and razor-focused. "Let's move," Evan said. They tore through the snow, leaving streams of powder behind them. The air grew colder as they ascended, the wind sharper, the sky darker. The silence of the ridge was broken only by the engines. And then, Shadow suddenly stiffened. A sound drifted over the wind, faint, weak, a howl, then another and another, a chorus of terrified voices rising from somewhere deep within the forest. Evan slowed the snowmobile to a crawl, raising a hand to signal the team behind him. Shadow leaned forward, ears pricked, body vibrating with alertness. "You hear that?" one deputy whispered. "Multiple dogs," the ranger medic confirmed. "Close, very close." They moved slowly now, listening, feeling the air change around them. Snow fell softly from the branches overhead, and the world narrowed into a tunnel of white and shadow. Then Shadow barked, sharp and decisive, before sprinting forward. "Shadow, wait!" Evan barely had time to steer off the trail before jumping off the snowmobile and chasing after him on foot. The German shepherd bounded between the trees, weaving through narrow spaces, following the cries that grew louder with each step. Evan followed until the forest opened into a small clearing, and then he stopped dead. Nestled between two massive pines was a cabin. Heavy tarps covered the windows. Snow had been shoveled in wide arcs around the structure, revealing boot prints, a small generator, and rough paths carved through the drifts. Smoke curled faintly from a cracked chimney. It was a base, improvised but structured, and from inside, a choir of weak, desperate whimpers echoed. Shadow growled low in his throat. The deputies moved into position, taking cover behind thick trunks. Evan approached the door slowly, gun drawn, eyes scanning every corner. He signaled with 2 fingers, and one deputy circled around back. Before Evan could issue a command, a voice barked from inside. "Who's out there?" The door flew open. A man stepped out, tall, heavy-set, wearing a thick parka smeared with mud and fur. His eyes were narrow, jittery. In his gloved hand, he clutched a wooden baton. Behind him, another man appeared, shorter, wiry, skin pale from the cold. A firearm sat tucked into his waistband, just barely concealed beneath his coat. Evan lifted his badge with one hand, the other steady on his holster. "Pine Meadow Police Department, hands where I can see them." The taller man cursed under his breath. The shorter one reached for his weapon. "Don't even think about it," Evan warned. Shadow sprang forward with a ferocity that sliced through the tension like a blade. The dog lunged straight at the taller man, clamping his jaws around the wrist holding the baton. The man screamed, stumbling backward as Shadow forced him down into the snow. The shorter man drew, but Evan was faster. "Drop it!" Evan barked. The deputy behind the cabin charged at precisely the right moment, slamming into the man from the side. The pistol skidded across the icy ground. Within less than 30 seconds, both suspects were pinned face down in the snow, their wrists secured with zip ties. The clearing fell silent, except for the cries from inside the cabin. Evan stepped over the fallen baton and pushed the door open fully. A blast of cold, metallic air washed over him. The smell hit instantly. Rust, old blood, fear, and helplessness all tangled together. Inside, rows of metal cages lined the walls. 14 cages, 14 dogs. Evan moved slowly, checking each one. Many of them were trembling, whimpering, their bodies curled tight in fear. Some were pets, others were clearly working dogs, intelligent eyes dulled by exhaustion. Each pair of eyes met his like a spark pleading for rescue. A golden retriever with frost in its whiskers. A border collie limping in its cage. A Belgian Malinois panting hard, ribs showing through its coat. A hound dog whining softly, tail tucked. These animals were survivors of something cold, calculated, cruel. "Hang in there," Evan whispered, kneeling beside the nearest cage. "We've got you now." Shadow sniffed each cage, tail wagging gently, an instinctive reassurance to the frightened dogs. Evan radioed the medic team. "We need warming blankets, immediate care, and transport carriers. 14 dogs, all alive but distressed." "On our way," the ranger medic answered. While the team moved in to stabilize the animals, Evan stepped outside to question the suspects, but something felt wrong. Shadow gave a low rumble and stayed close to him. "Where's your boss?" Evan asked coldly. The taller man spat blood onto the snow. "We're just movers." "Where is he?" The wiry man hesitated for the briefest moment. It was enough. Evan saw it in his eyes. Derek Mason was nowhere near this cabin. This was only a holding point, a temporary prison, and Copper. Copper could be here, or he could have already been taken somewhere else. Inside the cabin, the whimpering rose again, thin, trembling, but piercing. Evan turned toward the sound, recognition striking him like a bolt. He knew that cry. Shadow knew too. His ears shot up, tail straightening. They ran to the far corner of the cabin. The far corner of the cabin felt darker than the rest, as though the shadows themselves were protecting something fragile. Frost clung to the wooden beams overhead, dripping in slow, rhythmic taps that echoed across the cold floor. The rescuers worked quietly behind Evan, lifting frightened dogs from their cages, wrapping them in blankets, checking paws, breathing, eyes. Yet all that sound faded to nothing. As Evan moved deeper into the gloom, Shadow pressed close beside him. Shadow stopped suddenly. His tail froze. His ears shot forward. A single low whine escaped him, sharp, emotional, unlike the steady working dog sound Evan was used to hearing. "Easy, boy," Evan murmured, though his own chest felt tight. He angled his flashlight toward the back wall. There, huddled in the last cage, curled as small as he could make himself, was Copper. The German shepherd's once shiny coat looked dull beneath the beam of light. Frost clung to the ends of his fur. His sides rose and fell quickly, shallowly. He didn't bark, didn't cry out. He simply lifted his head the moment he sensed Evan and Shadow approaching. Copper's eyes, normally bright with curiosity and loyalty, looked tired, but alive. "Hey, buddy," Evan whispered, his voice breaking softly against the cold air. "We found you." Shadow let out another small sound, almost like a greeting. Copper's ears twitched, and for the first time since the night he was taken, his tail lifted just barely off the metal floor. Evan dropped to one knee, hands steady as he worked the latch. The padlock had been forced shut using a cheap latch mechanism, easy enough to break with a bit of pressure. Copper barely flinched as Evan gently pulled him into his arms. Copper weighed less than Evan remembered. The dog shivered uncontrollably, but the moment he felt Evan's chest, his weak tremors shifted into something else: recognition, fragile relief, a silent plea for reassurance. "You're okay," Evan said quietly. "You're safe now." Shadow sniffed Copper from nose to flank, a ritual of confirmation. Copper leaned weakly into it, offering the briefest nuzzle in return. Even exhausted and scared, a German shepherd never forgot its people. The ranger medic hurried over with blankets, wrapping Copper in thick insulation. "He's cold, dehydrated, but responsive," the medic said. "Bring him out to the warming tent. He has a real chance." Evan nodded. "Let's move." As they exited the cabin, the forest air seemed less suffocating than before, still cold, but no longer hostile. The medic team placed Copper gently into a portable heating bed near the snowmobiles. Shadow sat sentinel beside him, refusing to move more than a few inches away. The deputies loaded the captured guards into transport sleds, and one of them radioed, "Base confirmed. The Carter family has been notified. They're coming up the trail with an escort. They won't enter until we give them the all clear." Good. That was how it should be. The mountain wind softened as minutes passed. Copper's shaking eased. Color began returning, faint but real, around his muzzle. Shadow once nudged Copper's ear, as if telling him, "Don't you dare slip away now." And that was when Evan heard footsteps crunching through the snow. Fast, small, frantic. "Is it safe?" a woman's voice asked breathlessly from behind the medic tent. Evan turned. Mrs. Carter stood at the trail entrance, clutching her coat tightly around her thin frame. Her breath came in hard puffs that vanished into the icy air. Beside her, bundled in a thick winter jacket several sizes too big, was Lily. But Lily didn't run into the chaos. She stayed where the escort deputy held her shoulder gently. The protocol had been followed. No civilians allowed until the full perimeter was secured. Only when Evan gave a nod did the deputy release her. And Lily ran. Her boots left tiny prints in the snow as she sprinted up the slight slope, tears freezing on her cheeks even as new ones fell. She reached Copper just as Evan stepped back, giving her the space he knew she had earned. "Copper!" Lily cried, dropping to her knees so fast she nearly slipped on the icy ground. Copper lifted his head weakly. Then, gathering every ounce of strength left in his trembling body, he nudged his nose against her wrist. Lily sobbed and threw her arms around him, burying her face in his fur. Shadow watched the reunion with curious stillness, then sat beside Evan, tail sweeping slowly across the snow. Mrs. Carter approached more carefully, her bad leg stiff in the cold. When she finally reached Copper, her wrinkled hands touched the dog with reverence. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, voice cracking. "You held on. You really held on." Copper let out a soft whine, pressing into her touch. For a moment, the entire ridge seemed to quiet around them, the wind softer, the trees still, the world watching a tiny, fragile moment of reunion carved out of winter's cruelty. But even in that moment of peace, Evan's mind stayed sharp. The medic approached him quietly. "We've gone through the entire cabin. No sign of the ringleader, just these two men." Derek Mason, Evan said slowly. He's not here. No, but... The medic handed him a small notebook they'd found tucked under a table in the cabin. This was hidden in a crate. Evan flipped it open. Inside were rough notes, coded supply lists, dog descriptions, and next destination markers. A crude map of the region filled several pages, and one page circled in red. Outbound transfer, Wyoming border. Mason had moved on. This cabin had been nothing more than a middle stop, a place to collect the dogs before shipping them across state lines to buyers or trainers with illegal connections. Copper had been lucky. The other dogs had been lucky. But the operation wasn't done. Yet, Evan closed the notebook and exhaled, watching the mist rise from his breath. The family was safe. The dogs were saved. But the hunt wasn't over. Evan, Lily asked behind him, still holding Copper's neck in both arms. He turned back to her. "Thank you," she whispered. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it carried the weight of a child who had nearly lost something irreplaceable. Evan knelt in the snow beside her. "You were brave, and Copper was brave. He waited for you." Lily nodded, tears glistening like tiny crystals. Shadow leaned forward and touched his nose to Lily's knee, as if checking her temperature, her mood, her heart. Lily giggled, a thin giggle, still shaky but real. Mrs. Carter put a hand on Evan's arm. Her fingers were cold, trembling, but strong in a way he recognized. Strength born from love, fear, and survival. "I don't know how to repay you," she said. "You don't need to," Evan replied simply. "We take care of each other here." And that, in Pine Meadow, was as close to a vow as anyone needed. The team began loading the dogs gently into transport carriers. Copper was placed in a heated crate lined with soft blankets, but Lily insisted on riding in the vehicle that carried him. Evan allowed it. As they prepared to descend the ridge, Shadow hopped onto the snowmobile, glancing back at Evan as if asking, "What's next?" Evan took one last look at the cabin, its boarded windows, its cold iron cages, the fading footprints from the men they had arrested. This was just the surface. Derek Mason was still out there, pulling strings from a dark corner of the state. But for now, for this moment, the cold mountain had given back what it stole, and that was enough to keep Evan moving forward. The week after the rescue unfolded in slow, quiet layers across Pine Meadow, as if the town itself needed time to thaw from everything that had happened. Winter still held the valley firmly, coating rooftops in white and tracing lacework frost across every window pane. But there was a different feeling in the air now, something warmer, something patient, something like hope. Copper spent his days recovering at the town veterinary clinic, where heat lamps glowed softly and the smell of antiseptic mixed with pine-scented candles someone had brought to make the place feel less like a hospital. Shadow visited every morning with Evan, walking in proudly as if he had single-handedly rescued every dog on the mountain. Dr. Elaine Winters, the clinic veterinarian, mid-40s, short dark hair streaked with silver, and a voice gentle enough to calm both frightened animals and nervous children, oversaw Copper's recovery. She admired Shadow's discipline, but especially the way he always nudged Copper lightly, checking in as though he were an older brother, making sure the family stayed intact. Copper, though exhausted, healed quickly. His appetite returned. His tail wagged more each day. And every time Lily and Mrs. Carter visited, his entire body shook with joy, as if fear had finally loosened its grip on him. Evan found himself watching these visits longer than he intended. There was something grounding in seeing a family knit itself back together, something healing, even for a man who didn't talk much about his own wounds. Outside the clinic windows, Pine Meadow moved on with its quiet rhythm. Snowplows cleared the roads. The diner reopened after the storm, filling the air with the scent of pancakes and syrup. People dropped by the station with extra blankets and canned food for the animals being treated. It was what small towns did. They carried each other through winter. But even as the town breathed easier, Evan kept working. The notebook recovered from the cabin contained enough clues to direct the state task force. It wasn't clean, detailed intelligence, not a fully mapped-out network, but it was the spark that lit the final trail. 3 days after the rescue, just as dawn began to roll over the Wyoming border, the task force cornered Derek Mason in an abandoned mechanics shop. He tried to run. He failed. And when news reached Pine Meadow that the man behind the entire dog trafficking chain was in custody, a sigh of relief swept through the town like warm air through cold timber. The case was closed. Copper and all 14 dogs were officially safe. Justice had finally stepped into the winter. When Evan returned to the Carter cabin the following evening, carrying tools in one hand and a bag of insulation panels under his arm, he found Lily waiting at the door before he could even knock. "Officer Evan, come see," she said breathlessly, grabbing his sleeve with small, eager hands. She led him behind the cabin, where Copper trotted alongside her, stronger now, tail up, fur brushed and shining again. The old dog kennel had been pulled apart, the broken wood stacked neatly to one side. Fresh lumber lay on the ground, a hammer resting on top. "We're building Copper a new house," Lily declared proudly. "Grandma says a dog who survived a mountain deserves a palace." Mrs. Carter stepped out onto the back porch, arms folded across her cardigan, her breath drifting in pale puffs. Her face held that familiar sternness, but her eyes, always the truth-tellers, were warm tonight. "You didn't have to come help," she told Evan. "I wanted to," he replied simply. Shadow sniffed around the construction site, then plopped down beside Copper with a satisfied grunt, as if approving the improvements. Together, they rebuilt the kennel. Evan cut boards, Lily held nails. Even Mrs. Carter contributed, handing tools and giving advice in her steady, no-nonsense voice. By the time they finished, the sun had dipped behind the ridge, leaving a violet glow stretching across the snow. The new kennel stood firm, insulated, reinforced, warm, and sturdy enough to keep any storm at bay. "A place worthy of him," Evan said. "And safe," Mrs. Carter added softly. Copper tested the entrance, sniffing inside, before curling into the fresh hay laid at the back. Shadow lay beside the kennel door, like a silent guard promising nothing, like this would ever happen again. The evening air turned colder, the town lights flickered to life across the valley, and from somewhere far away, bells chimed softly, the church rehearsing for Christmas Eve. A week later, Pine Meadow gathered in the square for a small ceremony. No podiums, no polished speeches, just locals in thick coats, children with red cheeks, and snow falling gently around them like tiny blessings. Sheriff Dalton, a graying man with a kind face and a tired hat, stepped forward with 2 plaques. "We don't normally do things this formal," he began, "but this winter reminded us what courage looks like." He handed the first plaque to Evan. "Commendation for service. Officer Evan Marlowe, for bravery, persistence, and protection of the families of Pine Meadow." People clapped, stamping their boots against the snow. Evan's ears turned red in the cold, though Lily insisted it was because he was embarrassed. Then came Shadow's medal, a small silver medallion engraved with a paw print. "Shadow," Sheriff Dalton said, "you're officially our hero dog this winter." Shadow sat proudly as the medal was placed around his neck, tail sweeping the snow behind him. Copper barked once, as if cheering. When the applause finally softened, Lily stepped forward shyly, holding something behind her back. "I made this for you," she said to Evan. She handed him a drawing, 2 figures, Evan and Shadow, standing in falling snow, light glowing behind them. Copper, running toward them. Across the top, in careful handwriting, she had written, "Officer Evan and Shadow, the lights in the snow." Evan felt something warm and unfamiliar tug at his chest. He blinked once, twice, then lowered himself so he could meet Lily's eyes. "Thank you," he said softly. "I'll keep it." The ceremony faded into laughter and hot cider. People drifted home, stamping their feet and pulling their scarves tighter. And when the square finally quieted, Evan found himself standing beneath the town's towering Christmas tree. Snow drifted around him in soft spirals. Beside him stood Lily, Mrs. Carter, Shadow, and Copper, all gathered together beneath the shining lights. "Feels almost like family," Mrs. Carter murmured. Evan didn't know how to answer at first. He looked at the glow on Lily's face, the warmth in Mrs. Carter's eyes, the calm strength of Shadow sitting beside him. Then he smiled, an unguarded, honest smile. "Maybe it is," he said. The tree glowed brighter as if agreeing, its lights glittering across the snow like tiny fallen stars. Copper let out a soft bark, and the world felt small, warm, and peaceful for the first time in a long time. Winter still wrapped Pine Meadow tightly, but tonight, it felt like the season had given something back, something gentle, something healing, a small winter miracle. Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive with bright lights or thunder. Sometimes they come quietly through the courage of an officer who refuses to give up, through the loyalty of a dog who keeps fighting to return home, and through the kindness that rises in ordinary people when they choose love instead of fear. This story reminds us that even in the coldest winters of our lives, God walks beside us. He guides our steps, protects our families, and sends help in ways we never expect. In our everyday struggles, when we feel lost, tired, or overwhelmed, faith teaches us to look for the small signs, the quiet blessings, the moments when hope returns, like a warm light in the snow. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs encouragement. Leave a comment, tell us what you felt, and remember to subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and love. May God bless you and your family with peace, strength, and protection wherever you are. And if you believe in the miracles He still gives us, type Amen in the comments.